Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling.
Only a person of Mr. Churchill's mentality could congratulate anybody first on shooting unarmed men.
Looking out over London. At the moment, everything is quiet. For reasons of national as well as personal security, I am unable to tell you the exact location from which I'm speaking. Off to my left, far away in the distance, I can see just that faint, red, angry snap of anti-aircraft bursts against the steel blue sky. But the guns are so far away that it's impossible to hear them from this location. About 5 minutes ago, the guns in the immediate vicinity were working. I can look across just at a building not far away and see something that looks like a splash of white paint down the side. And I know from daylight observation that about a quarter of that building has disappeared, hit by a bomb the other night. The streets fan out in all directions from here, and down on one street I can see a single red light, and just faintly the outline of a sign standing in the middle of the street. And again, I know what that sign says, because I saw it this afternoon. It says, "Danger, unexploded bomb." Off to my left still, I can see just that red snap of the anti-aircraft fire. I was up here earlier this afternoon, and looking out over these housetops, looking all the way to the dome of St. Paul's, I saw many flags flying from staffs. No one ordered these people to put out the flags. They simply feel like flying the Union Jack above their roofs. No one told them to do it, and no flag up there was white. I can see one or two of them just stirring very faintly in the breeze now. You may be able to hear the sound of guns off in the distance, very faintly, like someone kicking a tub. Now they're silent. 4 searchlights reach up, disappear in the light of a 3/4 moon. I should say at the moment there are probably 3 aircraft in the general vicinity of London, because one can tell by the movement of the lights and the flash of the anti-aircraft guns. But at the moment, in the central area, everything is quiet. More searchlights spring up over on my right. I think probably in a minute we shall have the sound of guns in the immediate vicinity. The lights are swinging over in this general direction now. You'll hear 2 explosions. Just there they are. Again, moving in, still a considerable distance away. Moving still just a little closer. There you heard two. The searchlights are stretching out now in this general direction. I can hear just a faint whisper of an aircraft high overhead. Again, those guns are a considerable distance away. You'll hear them just vaguely in the background. Straight in front of me now. You'll hear two sounds in just a moment. There they are. That was the explosion overhead, not the guns themselves. I should think in a few minutes there may be a bit of shrapnel around here. Coming in, moving a little closer all the while. The plane is still very high, and it's quite clear that he's not coming in for his bombing run. Earlier this evening, we could hear occasionally, again, those were explosions overhead. Earlier this evening, we heard a number of bombs go sliding and slithering across to fall several blocks away. Just overhead now, the burst of the anti-aircraft fire. Still, the nearby guns are not working. And the searchlights now are feeling almost directly overhead. Now you'll hear two bursts a little nearer in a moment. There they are. That hard, stony sound.
Good evening and welcome to the Velocity of Now with me, your host Thomas Sheridan. I hope you enjoyed that intro. I'll explain what it's all about in a minute. Let me just say that today is Sunday, the 25th of September 2016, and this is the Sunday sermon edition of the Velocity of Now, a show that usually runs for an hour or so, just to give you something to get you through the weekend. When I was growing up, I used to hate Sundays, a load of shit, and so if I was a young lad again back in the 1980s in Ireland, I would have loved a show like this to basically remind me that the world isn't full of Muppets and it's not so boring after all. And so that was the purpose of the show, just something different. I don't think any other alt-media person is actually broadcasting on a Sunday, so most of them are probably recovering from like drinking 4 bottles of whiskey the night before, shagging whatever goddess they've just met, or they're on the run from their landlord because they spent their donation money on weed rather than actually rent, well, claiming to be free men and all this kind of thing. But anyway, enough of that shite. It's the website is www.thomassheridanarts.com or www.streetdruid.net. And I hope you've been enjoying the broadcast so far. That's why I do it. I do it for no other reason. Firstly, I want to apologize for the sound quality on the first hour of last Thursday night show. It's one of these gremlins that showed up. I can't help it. I don't know what went wrong. Ever since I do these shows like the Coronzon 333 show, appliances destroy themselves in my house, streetlights down the road break, and I'm plunged into darkness, and all kinds of electromechanical effects happens. This is the pure streams of energy, which tonight's show will be about. It's all about atmosphere. Now, before I get to that again, I want to say I did a very good interview this week with John Gibbons on Alchemy Radio. The link to the podcast is below if you want to listen to that. John was a very gracious host and asked excellent questions and was very enthusiastic. I've got upcoming interviews with Greg Moffat on legalized freedom regarding the Druid Code, so look out for that on James Swaggart's Megalithic network. I'll be on that as well. And I'm back to doing interviews again, but if you have a podcast that has 4 people, I'll also be doing a special with Aaron Franz and those guys at Cerebral Revolt on the movie, The Exorcist. So that should be interesting as well. That's the kind of things I'm only interested in now. So I'm saying, I'm back to doing interviews, but I'm not doing anything political. I'll still talk about psychopaths in terms of things like serial killers and stuff like that, but I'm not getting involved in any politics. It's muck. And I don't want to talk about, this is where my work is now. I think this is where you're enjoying it the most anyway. And go off and listen to InfoWars. Go off and listen to it. I don't want to waste my time with this stuff. Life's too short. And so if you've got like that kind of idea for a show, I'm not interested. Or if you have like 4 listeners to your podcast, I'm not going on to it, because it's not I'm a snob or anything like that. It's just I have to value my work, and I value my free time. And I have very, very little free time these days. And so if I'm going to actually give you an hour or two on an interview, it has to be worth my while, not just, just so I can boost your numbers. And I don't complain about it, because I've given hundreds of you profiles in the past, and I've boosted the numbers on your show, so you can't complain. It's just that I'm not getting any younger. There's more demands on my time. I'm working on a new book and this kind of thing, and I just don't. And I work a regular job, so I just don't have the time. So please try to understand that. That's also why I get hundreds of emails and private messages. I just can't get around to reply right away. It's not I'm a snob. I just literally, guys, I don't have the time. But I'll continue to do the VON as long as you care and as long as I'm still interested. So thank you for staying, and thank you for understanding when I have technical problems. It's often a result of this show being actually real, looking at it that way. Now, that intro that I played tonight, I hope you had, will set the atmosphere, because atmosphere is an important part of magic. It's an important part of the charge of magic. At the very beginning, you heard a character called Lord Haha, or Lord Haha. Germany calling, and that guy was an Irishman called William Joyce, who was employed by the Third Reich to make propaganda broadcasts into Britain during World War II. And so he would broadcast basically satirical, and actually it did it much better than anything the British came up with. And it actually had a big listenership because he was very funny, even though it was propaganda. The people did listen to him because he was kind of the Howard Stern of his day, working for the Nazis. And people listened to his broadcast. And when the war was over, you can actually hear his final broadcast, April 30th, Walpurgis Night, of course, 1945, on YouTube. He was captured by the British, and then they hanged him for treason, which makes no sense because he was an Irishman. But that's Churchill for you. And you mentioned at the beginning that someone of Churchill's disposition, well, we all know Churchill was a brutal, murderous psychopath. Then you heard a bit of a siren before the thing. The air raid sirens were all about what I'm talking about, the London Blitz and the atmosphere. And then just after the Velocity of Now theme tune, you heard the amazing and great American news broadcaster, radio broadcaster for CBS, Edward R. Murrow, and his legendary wartime broadcasts from London during the Blitz. Again, setting the atmosphere for tonight. Now, they don't make journalists like him anymore. In one episode, he went up in an RAF bombing raid on Berlin with a Lancaster bombing crew, and I think he was one of the few bombers that actually came back. The rest of them were all killed. And we don't make journalists like that anymore. The journalists we have today are people who, I don't know, with the exception of John Pilger and John Waters here in Ireland, the rest of them just take government or corporate or university press releases and they rewrite them. And then they pat each other on the back and think they deserve awards. But that's to give you an idea of what we're talking about tonight. Now, before I say there's anything special about the casualty numbers of the London Blitz, although 40,000 people died, and we must respect that, the London Blitz was no different than all the other bombings that took place across Europe. It wasn't the only British city that was bombed. Hull in the northeast of England and Yorkshire was levelled because it was a seaport. Liverpool, Belfast in Ireland, Northern Ireland, was ferociously bombed in a horrific attack. My hometown of Dublin was bombed in a couple of times. They said accidentally, but down on the North Strand, you can actually see the shrapnel holes still in the old tram poles. There are now streetlights on the streets from where the bombs exploded and killed like a load of people. And from Rotterdam all across to Minsk and Warsaw, everywhere in between, there was, and let's not forget the worst of all, Churchill's disgusting war crime on Dresden. Absolutely no reason to bomb that city. It was not a strategic place. It was basically hospitals, and he bombed all the hospitals there and destroyed a beautiful ancient city and killed God knows how many hundreds of thousands of people by burning them alive and sucking the oxygen out of the air. So the London Blitz is not, and of course Berlin, and I'm not going to, I can name all the cities going all night long that suffered in World War II, but specifically I'm dealing with London tonight because remember, when London was being bombed, it was the centre of the British Empire. It was and still remains Babylon. It's a city that has a special energy about it because of its foundation. It was built prior to the Romans in veneration of the god Lu, and from that the Romans called it Londinium, and it'll always has been and always will be a special place. Love it or hate it, that's London for you. I actually quite love it, and the reason I'm focusing on the London Blitz in particular, which took place between the 7th of September 1940 and the 21st of May 1941, which was a German failure, no matter how you look at it, was because so many interesting things happened there at the time. Try to imagine you live in, probably it was the largest city, one of the largest city in the Western world at that time anyway, right? And then the lights all going out, complete darkness, and that air raid sirens coming, and then the anti-aircraft guns, in the distance, and those lights pointing up at the clouds, and you're able to see the German bombers, and that distinctive out-of-phase engine whirring of the Hinkel bombers. No other bomber sounded like them. The engines went terrifying. You'd often get sometimes flying over later on in the war. You would get Stuka dive bombers with their distinctive Valkyrie siren as they're coming in to bomb it, and then the lights in total darkness, and then you're hearing the bomb getting closer. The bombs falling from the planes, getting closer to your house, and boom. Then you count 7 seconds. Boom. Count 7 seconds more. Boom. And it gets louder. The psychic charge is phenomenal, and then you hear the bomb blowing up on the street behind you, and you know you haven't been killed. I mean, this is how people were living. This is how people existed. They went into the underground tube system. It created all kinds of dynamics. It released vast amounts of energy, and in particular sexual energy. You would have had the best shagging in the world at that time, because people thought this was the end. So when you have this kind of situation, you will have enormous amounts of sexual energy released, and basically you would have had that in incredible quantities. This is sex energy. This is all part of the psychic charge, this magic charge. And you're in the basement or you're in the Anderson shelter in the backyard with your wife or your girl, and you're having an amazing sex time while the sirens are going off in the air, and you're hearing the boom, 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 boom of the anti-aircraft. You telling me that's not sex magic? You telling me that would not be the best sex you would ever have? This would be unbelievable. You would have had a whole underground world that would have existed on top of the looting and everything. You would have had a black market. You would have had serial killers who would have had taken the opportunity of the chaos caused by the war in order to hunt. You would have lived in Dante's Inferno. You would have lived in a world that was beyond surreal. You would have been the dancer in the Terminator. That's what you would have been. And not only would you have lived from second to second knowing that death was also around the corner, but you would also have lived and experienced life to the absolute extreme. Constant adrenaline rushes. And on top of that, walking through an urban scape of burning fire, smoke, incendiary bombs coming down on little parachutes. This is what happened. They used to send in the main bombs, and they would blow the tops off the buildings because the bombs weren't that big. Occasionally they would demolish buildings, but the real damage was done when the roof was knocked off the building. Then they would drop these little incendiary bombs on, they were little kind of phosphorus firelights, and they would fall into the buildings and then start the fire. And when you had the firestorm, that's when it was really dangerous, because not only was this the danger of being killed by the fire itself, the maelstrom of the firestorm, but also the oxygen being burnt out of the air by all the fires around you. So you would have been in a state of terror, but you also would have been at your most alive. Like when someone climbs Everest. There would have been millions of people living like that. Now, as I said, it took place in London between the 7th of September 1940, the Blitz itself, and the 21st of May 1941. London was attacked 71 times, and there was 57 nights of continuous bombing. So think about that, 57 nights of continuous bombing. If you look online, you can see actually a map of London where all the bombs landed, and it's just literally incredible. Of course, like, none landed on Buckingham Palace, but like, that's for another discussion. Over 1 million houses were destroyed in London or damaged, and 40,000 civilians were killed in this 57 nights. Just think about that by today's standards. The main attacks were, of course, on the East End of London. That was not only where the docks were, the Isle of Dogs and those kinds of places, but also it was where the working class who worked in those docks were. So they suffered the most appalling and high level of casualties. But to say that only the working class were killed, that's not true. There was many middle class and upper class people were killed in the bombings as well. But the working class, as in any other war, get the absolute worst of it. And this is just because they lived where the ports and where the industries were, and these were the prime targets for the Luftwaffe. And yet the resolve of the British people was not broken. In fact, if anything, they looked back on it with a sense of joy, this spirit of the Blitz. They became friends with their neighbours closer. They worked together, even though they were half-starved. They were, because of wartime rationing. They looked back on the time as a time of great bonding and great. They called it the spirit of the Blitz. It was almost like when you're reduced. This is another thing in these situations. Not only is the psychic charge phenomenal, but when you're reduced down to your basic needs for survival, the real you comes out. And you'll either be a parasite who will rob the eyeball out of the person next to you, or you'll be like 99% of the people. You will show tremendous human decency towards your fellow man. And you'll look beyond his social status, or his or her religion, and so on. And you will just reach out. This is why we have all these social justice warriors today. These people have no hardship. So they become absolute bastards. If there was a war tomorrow, we'd see how people really were. We live in an age of artificiality. The real point of the London Blitz was basically the Battle of Britain itself to destroy the RAF, which didn't happen. Along with the bombing itself, there was some very strange things took place, and very tragic things at Bethnal Green tube station on the 3rd of March. This is like after the Blitz, but there was still reports of bombings happening. The British media reported a heavy raid on Berlin on the night of the 1st of March, and in London, the civil defence air raid siren went off at 8:17, and it made an orderly flow of people in that part of London into the train station, into this underground tube station, and something happened. There was heavy anti-aircraft guns. There were a new type of anti-aircraft gun that sounded like bombs dropping, were set off nearby, and people started not panicking but running quickly down into the tube station. And at the very bottom of a staircase, a middle-aged woman who was holding a child, she fell over 3 steps from the base, and others fell on top of her, and they all tangled and they grew together and struggled. Nearly 300 people, and within no time 173 of them just in the stairwell, most of them were women and children, were crushed or asphyxiated. I mean, it was an absolute disaster. It was a horror. And these were the kind of things that happened. These were the kind of horrors that would go on, but also these would also add to the intensity. Things are bad enough as they are, but 173 people being killed because someone tripped on the steps of a tube station. And London itself carries this energy with it, not so much now, but I actually feel it all the time when I'm there, but not like it used to. And let's talk about the psychic wars of aspects of this, You have the intensity of war. It brings out magical ideas, magical ways of thinking that would not otherwise be tolerated or be as socially accessible these ideas would be during peacetime. Because the necessity for both personal and collective survival, it brings up the ancient ghosts of the primitive shadow psyche. And that shadow psyche has been securely sequestered, locked, and incarcerated beneath the civilized surface that we all carry during more peaceful, tranquil, and stability-infused days before death and destruction comes knocking upon one's door. This is why it's very easy for people in peacetime to judge and classify people who went through wars and suffered through wars, but they remember things are very different in wartime than they are in peacetime. During peacetime, we have a detachment from all manner of mass death and terror. And this means that we as modern people can entertain these notions that were both reasoned and logical, because that all comes about from the conformity of placidity. It affords us to a shelter of kinds from the irrational and the predictable. And this is where all these the bunkers and these educated idiots come from, and these skeptical debunkerlies. This is where they all come from, these professional debunkers. They live in an age of peace and prosperity and comfort and safety, so they can afford to be smug, reasoned, and logical. But however, when the horrors of war and possible violent death arrive or become imminent, we are transported very, very quickly, folks, back to the status of superstitious savagery. The savage below the surface, and I'm not talking about like savage like in murderous, I mean literally the primitive, the aboriginal below the surface, which is, if you have any sense, you should always try to keep it in your personality. Walk with your shadow, don't deny it. And suddenly, when these things happen, we're not so very different from our ancient ancestors. We had previously taken comfort in evaluating as being less educated and less sophisticated than our own self-model image. And this is what happens during war. Happened in the Great War, World War I. Suddenly, when the Western Front and things fell apart, soldiers started collecting talismans. Jewish soldiers would have holy medals, St. Christopher's, anything you get your hands on to give you the belief that you had some kind of talisman against death. And there's also something about war that brings up the other sensations that pertain to the overall survival of the human species and how we managed to survive traumatic episodes in the past. So this is when we'll often have people during these episodes, and this is a new book I'm writing at the moment, and things like this, they recount the stories and the tales of, say, the walls of Jericho or the submergence of Atlantis. We still survived. Vesuvius, Herculaneum, we still survived. Humans went on. And these stories, they give us hope that our society that's being currently torn asunder, that in time we as a species at least will prevail, just like others have survived previous cataclysms in the past. After all, there's really no difference between a city that's being consumed by Luftwaffe or RAF or American bombs and incendiary devices, or that of a city being submerged beneath the waves like Atlantis. It's only the specifics of the annihilation that differ, and also the immediacy of it. This is why disasters like I spoke in the Druid Code, like the Titanic thing, now they stick with us. And this is why Atlantis sticks with us. And this is why this show about the Blitz is important. Death and war, when it's happening to someone else far away, becomes a cold and analytical topic of discussion and, hard political philosophy. But when it arrives at your front door, my friends, the ancient fears and superstitions that lay hidden within the alcoves of the human condition can very quickly step out of the light to remind us all that just beyond the twilight world of that social and cultural turmoil that we're experiencing during wartime or during something 9/11 lays a desperate salvation within the mysterious and the superstitious. They go hand in hand. Like the show I did the other night on as New York was falling to pieces in the 70s, you have the rise of magic, mystery, and cults. So what people shunned and mocked in peacetime can very, very quickly become the only crutch we have left when the angel of death darkens our door. In a time such as this, we're all reminded that we are all potential Atlanteans, just like people were in New York in 9/11, 2001, and just like in the London Blitz. And at the height of the London Blitz in September 1940, when the German Luftwaffe, just like that Edward R. Murrow report I put in there, for 57 nights reduced over 1 million homes to rubble, killed over 40,000 civilians, like I said. Just imagine that. Just imagine the sound of the air raid sirens as they begin to fill the nightscape of British cities, and especially London. As the lights are out, the terrified and the vulnerable civilian population, you enter into an altered state of consciousness. The desire for survival unleashes a psychic firestorm that manifests in the revival of religious salvation and, more likely, old superstitions. There's a point where you go, "Oh, Jesus save me! Oh, Jesus save me!" Well, that actually runs out, and you start to look for the witches and the magicians. And let me tell you, they're not always easy to find, because the witches and the magicians are the only ones who seem to actually get a charge or do well in wartime. At the time of the London Blitz, among the educated and middle classes, the world of the metaphysical and the esoteric tapped into this wartime charge, this physical psychic charge, in the form of magicians, cranks, oddballs, eccentric artists, and other what they call queer characters, dodging the German bombs and incendiary devices, while finding that heightened psychological and emotional state was allowing them to indulge in their own craft and conjurations with a sense of almost religious freedom, as essentially the English witchcraft law was temporarily set aside in light of wartime conditions. You know, can you only imagine how a person making their way through the burning streets of London during the late night hours, where the double-decker buses are still running? During the bombing, the London Transport still ran their buses. They were blacked out except for a few lights at the top. So you'd have these huge double-decker buses coming around the corner with just a tiny light at the upper deck, while bombs are going off around you, and you jump on, you pay a fare, and then going to a tube station and submerging yourself into the subterranean world of the London Underground, where thousands and thousands took refuge. You'll be entering into a kind of Dante's Inferno of the modern consciousness, the World War II consciousness. And within these conditions, there was a tremendous psychic charge unleashed, and this becomes the fodder of magic and mysticism, born out of mayhem and great art. I saw a documentary once on the British sculptor Henry Moore, and they were interviewing his private secretary, and she was like this beautiful young 19-year-old girl at the time, and he was a married man in his 30s, late 30s or so, and he's already kind of well known. And he took his private secretary down into the tube station so he could do sketches of the people sheltering from the bombs, and to try and show her how art is generated in these moments. Art has the same charge. And in the interview she said, although nothing happened between them, the physical act of walking through the London tube with him holding her hand, he would hold her hand. He was apparently a wonderful gentleman, old English gentleman, but he was also quite a good-looking man as well. He would held his young secretary's hand and just led her through the tube station during the bombing. She said it was the most incredible sexual energy she ever felt in her life, even though no sexual thing took place between them. Just being in that situation, Henry Moore kindly holding her hand, taking care of her, as well as her general sort of admiration for the man as an artist and a person, said that it was the greatest sex she ever had in her life, even though nothing happened between them. This is all part of the charge. And even though there was rationing of food and other forms of energy during the Blitz-laden months of 1940 and 41, there was also this veritable cornucopia of magical, paranormal, metaphysical, and spiritual forms of energy. for anyone, and especially artistic, for anyone wishing to avail of their, shall we say again, queer indulgences. Once it did not get in the way of the Ministry of Defence and infringed upon their wartime secrets. There was a case of a Scottish spiritualist named Helen Duncan. In the 1940s, she brought forth during a seance perfectly accurate information concerning the sinking of the Royal Navy's elite battleship HMS Hood. Before the event was made public, a sailor who had been killed in the sinking of HMS Hood had come to her in a seance and told her what happened, who died, and the particulars concerning the sinking of HMS Hood. This was not made public by the Admiralty in England, because of the huge loss of life and the sinking of their largest and most powerful battleship would have on public morale. This brought her, her seance, or shall we say her spiritualist abilities, brought her to the attention of a guy called Brigadier Roy Firebrace. And he was the head of a military intelligence in Scotland, and he deliberately went to her seances to see if she was actually a German spy who had somehow got information on the sinking of HMS Hood. Apparently, he came to the conclusion that she was a genuine thing, that she really was able to contact the dead, and she ended up being recruited by Churchill himself. And when the war was over, they went back to normal, and she found herself locked up under the Witchcraft Act in Holloway Prison for her powers as a medium. So you see what I mean? During war, Helen Duncan was fine. Her incredible paranormal powers were used upon by the War Ministry, because we're in a different psychic state. When the war was over, they throw her in Holloway Prison under the Witchcraft Act. There was also during the same time when these German bombs were falling down on the Blitz that the Great Beast himself, he's everywhere. Have you noticed that? He's right everywhere. The Great Beast, Aleister Crowley, was drafting and redrafting and altering and changing the rough proofs of the Thoth Tarot deck artwork with the visionary artist and a gifted young artist called Lady Farida Harris, after she met him at Crowley's lodgings at 93 Jeremy Street in Piccadilly. On the other side of this now great burning metropolis during the London Blitz, another one of our old friends of the Velocity of Now, this brilliant art, mentioned here by me a lot, brilliant artist, author, and occultist Austin Osman Spare found himself badly injured and homeless after the Luftwaffe had destroyed his apartment and all his artwork with a bomb. And even so, he went around basically DOS houses for homeless and vagrant men in Wandsworth. This is a guy who'd been a well-known artist before the war. Even Hitler had wanted one of his paint to do a portrait of him. And here he was living in a DOS house and eventually living in basically a shed in Brixton with two cats, with a couple of stray cats belonging to a friend who didn't have a pot to piss in either. This was it. And even so, with two damaged arms, his artwork and his books and his life destroyed, Austin Osman Spare was immediately charged by the situation and began working on new research into the occult and new creative articles, illustrations for books and so on. And then another occultist, Dion Fortune, she had a magical order known as the Fraternity of Inner Light. They began a series of meditations in an attempt to defeat the Third Reich. This is like the allied side of what you've read about in my book, Walpurgis Night. And she was doing this, her order of the Fraternity of Inner Light was doing this within the magical battlefields of the astral realms, having correctly taken heed of the Scottish folklorist and occult scholar Lewis Spence when he published his book in 1940, pointing out that the Third Reich was more of a mystical organization than anything else, when he wrote his book, The Occult Causes of the Present War. You see how war brings about this stuff? War brings about this stuff. And a character I'm actually working on a kind of a semi-biography of him at the moment as my next book, who was living in a cottage in the Scottish borders in the historic county of Peeblesshire, John Foster Forbes in Solway Cottage was constantly engaged with the Council for Prehistoric Research at Caxton Hall in London, in Palmer Street in Westminster, between Big Ben and Westminster Palace, in order to put together a discussion, a lecture series on why the megaliths of Western Europe are connected to Atlantis, and why folklore, and particularly Irish folklore, reveals this. The man was doing the Druid Code 60, 70 years ago. I only discovered him while I was researching for the Druid Code. His work blew my mind, and I'm going to, and there's so little on him out there. I spent a fortune buying whatever books and papers I could belong to him, and I'm going to produce a biography on the man, John Foster Forbes, before the end of the year. I'm already about a quarter of the way through it. That's something for you to look forward to. But what makes Caxton Hall in Westminster so interesting, right, is that, again, Aleister Crowley in 1910 performed the rite of elusive, the ritual there, which is described by the media, of course, as blasphemous and erotic. This is what makes London so special, right? And on top of that, you have the Blitz. So you already have a city that has a phenomenal energetic charge. Add to that the energetic charge caused by the war, the Blitz, the bombs falling down. Add to that the energetic charge of all these characters in the city: Crowley, Farida Harris, Dion Fortune, occasionally John Foster Forbes, Austin Osman Spare, or artists like Henry Moore. Add to that the charge of the near means of survival. And suddenly our lives in our world of modernity, don't they seem very, very ordinary indeed? I mean, I think, although I wouldn't like to be badly injured or see my family and friends being killed in such a situation, I'd be lying if I said there was a part of me regrets not having experienced what people experienced during the Blitz and survived to tell. These things don't happen for a reason. It's like they don't detract these kinds of characters I'm mentioning for that reason. I can remember back in the 70s living in Ballymun, this high-rise sort of like housing project in Northside Dublin. There was power strikes because of a shortage of fuel. And so they had to shut the lights off at night. And there was also strikes with the power company. And I can remember walking around the high-rise buildings and the streets with no lights on, the whole city in darkness, and absolutely loving it. I was a very emotional and sensitive child anyway. And so I was very emotionally and sensitively connected to anything like this. And I can remember that sensation of charge from being in this twilight experience, while other people, and then only seeing the flicker of candles in the window and seeing how it affected people. When the power was off, the TV was off, right? The TV was off. So the TV is off, right? And then people literally have nothing. They go mad for the first few days, or and then they actually get normal. But when this didn't happen long enough, when I was a kid experience, and when the TV came back on, it was like salvation. It was like Jesus came back down from heaven. This is how powerful. This is when, as a young child, I started to realize the magic and the power of television. How it was basically a kind of a passive curfew. The idea of this idea of the passive curfew, using entertainment and football and sport on TV to keep you indoors. Pokemon Go was a passive curfew. I probably would have been wandering the streets. I know I would have been wandering the streets of London during the Blitz. I would have been in my element. I would have loved it. Now, of course, it would have been dangerous, but I know it would have been on the cusp of being alive, the cusp of being. This experience, to me, would not in the least be. It might be frightening at the moment, but prior to it, when the sound of that air raid siren started and when it ended, I could imagine that the people who were living in that moment probably never felt any more alive in their life. and I bet the magic rituals that took place during the London Blitz, whether they took place in manor homes, posh houses, or middle class or slum dwellings of people like Austin Osman Spare, I bet the results were phenomenal. I bet the results were incredible. This is where the Foo Fighters came from in Berlin at the end of World War II. I bet they were amazing. Another aspect of the Blitz is Jack the Ripper. Now, I know that's a weird one, right? But Jack the Ripper, the Ripper murders happened in 1888, which Alan Moore in the East End of London in Whitechapel, which Alan Moore basically said was the beginning of the modern world, and I think he makes a very good point of that. Also, in 1889, Adolf Hitler was born, and so was Charlie Chaplin. Coca-Cola came about, the Eiffel Tower was built, John Foster Forbes was born. So yeah, 1888, 1889, yeah, the modern world began. Starry Night was painted by Van Gogh, and so on. The Austro-Hungarian Empire started to fall into decay with a bizarre double suicide in the royal family, and so on. The Johnstown flood happened in Pennsylvania too. But if you read any books on Jack the Ripper, which is all I find a very interesting subject, you see that the streetscapes are all gone today. If you go down to Whitechapel today on these Jack the Ripper tours, they're terribly, terribly disappointing. Because all the buildings and all the streets and all the lanes are all gone. They were all destroyed in the Blitz. So it was all, and did you ever see that movie, The Krays, with the two guys from Spandau Ballet? They're playing the kids. When the kids were playing them, the Kray brothers, who were real gangsters in London, were playing them as kids in the Blitz during World War II. And there was a guy there telling them horror stories as the bombs were dropping. And the story was of the night he encountered Jack the Ripper as a young boy. And again, these stories came about because of the Blitz. The supernatural world becomes more real. There's no difference between in the Blitz in the tube station during the war and going into the deep dark forest. It's the groves that are the columns on the walls of the tube stations. It's the same psychic charge. It's the reason why the Druids went into the deep forest. The same reason. So that's today's show. I hope you have a nice Sunday. We'll cut a bit short because I don't want to repeat myself. But anything you want to add to this, hopefully the sound is better. And I will see you again on Thursday evening with another 2 hours of the Velocity of Now. And feck 'em if they can't take a joke, and enjoy your Sunday. Thank you.